1st January 1942. The German advance in Russia had been halted by tenacious resistance and the onset of winter, and the invaders had turned against the civilian population, hoping that terror tactics would succeed where conventional warfare had failed. Villagers, men, women, and children, had been summarily executed, and the young girls forced into prostitution, serving the German soldiers. These atrocities did not soften the Russians, but created a hatred for the invaders and a desire for revenge that was to last until the day Soviet tanks raced into Berlin more than 3 years later. January 2, 1942. Manila falls to the Japanese. After the success at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked key targets in the Pacific and Far East with astonishing speed. A major Japanese force had landed in the Philippines 3 days after Pearl Harbor, on the 10th of December, 41, and found that they both outnumbered and outgunned General MacArthur's forces. The Japanese General Homma had planned to encircle the defenders, but MacArthur decided to move west to Bataan instead of defending Manila. Manila fell, but the Allies had saved their army that now held out against the Japanese for a further 5 months. 3rd of January, 1942. B-17 production stepped up. The most successful American bomber at the time was the B-17, the Flying Fortress. Though this aircraft had been in production since the late 30s, production now had to be increased dramatically to keep up with the demands, and the Boeing factories acted swiftly. New assembly lines, building sections to be assembled later, were constructed, allowing Boeing to build more aircraft per square foot than any other manufacturer, and many other labor-saving devices would also help to speed up the manufacturing process. Many of the systems used here would be adopted by other arms manufacturers and thus greatly help the American war effort. January 7, 1942. Japanese attack U.S. carrier. The aircraft carrier was pivotal during the war in the Pacific. Despite the Japanese success at Pearl Harbor, they had not managed to destroy or damage any of the American carriers. The vast expanse of this particular theater of war meant that air superiority could not depend on land bases, so the destruction of the enemy's floating airfields was of paramount importance. During the early part of the war, Japanese dive and torpedo bombers, supported by Zero fighters, posed a real threat to the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and many of its surface vessels, including carriers, were lost or damaged in surprise attacks such as this. 11th of January 1942. Japanese enter Kuala Lumpur. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they simultaneously struck at a number of other selected targets, for example Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. The Japanese 18th Division, under the command of the choleric Lieutenant General Mutaguchi, had landed at Endau on 8th of January, largely unopposed. 3 days later, the Japanese 5th Division marched into Kuala Lumpur, the epitome of English colonial power, and a rich prize for the Japanese with its enormous stocks of food, arms, and ammunition. 13th of January 1942. U-boat offensive along U.S. East Coast begins. Germany's high command belief in the usefulness of their U-boat flotillas goes back to the First World War, when the Germans began to target shipping sailing by the U.S. coast from the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean in January 1942. The U.S. government refused to profit from the British experience and black out the coastline, claiming it would harm civilian morale. As a result, for more than 6 months, shipping in the area was brilliantly silhouetted against hundreds of miles of lighting, making the task of Admiral Karl Donitz's 21 U-boats all too easy, sinking no less than 505 ships by June. 17th of January, 1942. Stukas grounded due to bad weather. The Stuka dive bomber had been an extremely efficient weapon for the Germans during the Blitzkrieg attack on Poland in 1939, and during the early campaigns in France, and not least during Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union. Conventional artillery could not keep up with the fast-moving German panzer divisions, so Stuka squadrons substituted, a kind of airborne artillery. However, whilst the fierce Russian winter slowed down, the German ground forces, the Stukas were, more or less, put out of action on the Eastern Front, and it might be argued that this fact was instrumental in halting the German drive through to Moscow. 20th of January 1942. Final solution. The Wannsee Conference, held in the Berlin suburb of the same name, was organized by Adolf Eichmann with the purpose of increasing the efficiency with which the state could exterminate undesirable population groups, predominantly Jews, but also Slavs, left-wing activists, homosexuals, and gypsies. As a direct consequence of this infamous conference, the SS officer Christian Wirth established the extermination camps at Chelmo, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. These new camps, run like factories of death, accounted for the killing of at least 3 million Jews and countless other minorities. 25th of January 1942. Rommel captures Mazouz. After having been on the receiving end for some time in the North African desert, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, enjoyed a change in fortune. On 5th of January 1942, a large shipment of supplies had arrived at Tripoli. As good as a victory in battle, Rommel was not about to allow men or material to stay idle, and he struck on the morning of 21st of January, finding, as he expected, the British forces in some disarray after their push forward. The Deutsche Afrika Korps moved rapidly east, reaching Agadabia in a couple of days and taking Mazouz on 25th of January, adding to the legend of the Desert Fox. 29th of January 1942. Rommel advances on Bars. Since Rommel launched his attack on the British Eighth Army on 21st of January 1942, his panzer had made light of the opposition. The British were at this point hampered by an extremely long supply line stretching all the way back to Egypt. A German panzer division had cut off an entire British armored brigade near Saunu. On the 28th of January, the German 90th Light drove into Benghazi, and the following day, the advance continues towards Bars, Marawa, and Derna. The speed of operation and the apparent ease in overcoming opposition added to the legend of the Afrika Korps' invincibility. 11th of February 1942. Scharnhorst escapes from Brest up through the English Channel. Despite Germany's control over continental Europe, the British Navy was still more than a match for the Axis powers. The Germans had 3 major vessels sheltering in the French naval port of Brest: the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau, and the Prinz Eugen. On the 11th of February 1942, all 3 left the protection of Brest and dashed under full steam up through the English Channel. German intelligence was excellent. There was, at the time, no strong British naval presence on their route. The RAF did a futile attempt to stop the German ships, but without much success, and they safely reached German North Sea ports. 15th of February 1942. Singapore capitulates. Kuala Lumpur had fallen to the Japanese on the 11th of January, and the next big prize on the Malaysian peninsula was the British stronghold of Singapore. As the Japanese forces advanced, 80,000 British troops withdrew and were penned inside a 45-kilometer perimeter around the city. The British commander, General Percival, ignored directives from Winston Churchill and hoisted the white flag on the 15th of February, to be known in British history as Black Sunday. The Japanese commander Yamashita and General Percival met in the Ford factory at Bukit Timah, and within minutes Percival had agreed to unconditional surrender. 26th of February 1942. U-boats threaten Allied convoys in the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic convoys were an essential lifeline for the Allies. These vital convoys were, however, vulnerable to attacks from German submarines, the U-boats. The vast expanses of the North Sea were ideal hunting grounds for the U-boat packs, particularly the area between Iceland and Great Britain and the northernmost part of the route to Murmansk in the Soviet Union. Throughout 1942, German U-boats sank no less than 6,226,215 tons of Allied shipping. Churchill later wrote, "The U-boat attacks of 1942 was our worst evil." 27th of February 1942. Allied fleet defeated in Battle of Java Sea. The Japanese had captured Bali on the 19th of February 1942 and were ready to land on the more important target of Java. The Battle of the Java Sea took place between the 27th of February and the 1st of March between a strong Japanese naval force covered by several air squadrons from airfields in Borneo and a smaller Allied fleet that had lost all air cover when the carrier Langley was sunk by Japanese aircraft. The battle was a resounding success for the Japanese, whose new liquid oxygen-propelled torpedoes accounted for 4 Allied destroyers, including the flagship De Ruyter. 28th of February 1942. Japanese invade Java. The Battle of the Java Sea was still raging, but the Japanese were clearly in the ascendancy and could invade Java on the 28th of February 1942. In fact, the Allied naval defense did not delay the planned invasion by a single day. Japanese ground forces, with comprehensive air support, could now advance from their original beachhead without fear of an Allied counterattack. Already, on the 8th of March, the Japanese commander-in-chief accepted the Governor-General's unconditional surrender, and Japan had taken possession of the Dutch East Indies with all its oil, tin, bauxite, rice, rubber, and coffee, a rich and important prize. 8th of March 1942, Rangoon Falls. Though the British had successfully captured the Setang Bridge, the most direct route to Rangoon for the advancing Japanese forces, the city's fate was still inevitable as the Imperial Army had crossed the river further north. Rangoon was also in a state of panic. The police had deserted, Burmese and Indians fought over old grievances, and looting was rife. The commander of Rangoon, General Hutton, was replaced by Lieutenant General Harold Alexander, who had to flee almost the moment he arrived, only narrowly escaping capture. So on the 8th of March, the Japanese could enter the city without noticeable opposition and further consolidate their position in Burma. 10th of March 1942. Dutch East Indies falls to Japanese. The Japanese had defeated the Allied Navy in the Battle of the Java Sea on the 27th of February 1942 and had subsequently invaded the island of Java. The situation throughout the island was now lost to the Allies, and on the 7th of March the Japanese commander-in-chief demanded talks with his Dutch counterpart and the Dutch commander-in-chief. During the afternoon of the 8th of March, and under threat of a devastating bombardment of the town of Bandung, an unconditional surrender was agreed. The Japanese conquest of the East Indies had been completed in 3 months, much to the military leaders' satisfaction, as they had expected the campaign to take 6 months. 21st of March 1942. Leningrad still holds out. The winter of 1941-42 was one of the strongest on record in a country that is known for its harsh climate, and the city of Leningrad had now been under siege since September the previous year. Water and power had been cut, and a constant artillery barrage added to the misery, and the food was running out, the daily bread ration reduced as little as 110 grams per citizen per day. But still, in the midst of death and deprivation, the population held out and showed both courage and ingenuity in finding ways of coping with life and the enemy. Still, 1.25 million perished in this, the longest siege in modern history. The 10th of April 1942. Americans finally give up and leave Bataan. When the Japanese attacked the Philippines in December 1941, the 2 main targets had been the capital, Manila, and the Clark airfields, also on the island of Luzon. The American forces eventually withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula to make a stand, and they did indeed manage to hold off the Japanese for several months. The Japanese launched their final attack on the 5th of April 1942, Good Friday. Aircraft from Clark Airfield dropped 60 tons of bombs on the American defenses, and the 65th Japanese Brigade smashed through the central positions on the 7th, and the U.S. Second Corps began to disintegrate, finally surrendering on the evening of the 9th of April. The 4th of May, 1942. Japanese fire more than 16,000 grenades at Corregidor. The tiny island of Corregidor had been under siege by the Japanese forces since the end of December 1941. On the 4th of May 1942, the Japanese finally launched a decisive attack against the besieged forces. Bataan, which had been taken earlier, was an ideal site for General Homa's artillery. The current assault, plus earlier bombardments, had left the Corregidor defenses in tatters. Most of the fortifications had been destroyed, and there was hardly a gun placement left intact. Corregidor was ready for the taking. The 6th of May, 1942. Corregidor falls to Japanese. Intense bombing had taken its toll on the small island fortress of Corregidor in the Philippines, and the Japanese commander, General Homa, was ready for the invasion. There was little more than scattered groups of Marines, soldiers, sailors, and Filipino scouts to meet the invasion, and most of these were administrative personnel armed with whatever they could find in the reigning chaos. When the landing came, they opened fire with every pistol, rifle, and machine gun, but without direction or coordination, and by 10 o'clock on the 6th of May, 1945, the Japanese could bring ashore both tanks and light artillery, and the American commander, General Wainwright, surrendered to General Homa. The 30th of May, 1942. First RAF 1000 bomber raid on the German town of Cologne. The RAF had, after the Battle of Britain, launched several air raids against Germany herself, typical targets being Hamburg and the important naval port of Bremerhaven. On the 30th of May, 1942, the RAF mounted the first 1000 bomber raid on the city of Cologne, an important industrial center. The raid made thousands of people homeless and killed more than 500 civilians, whilst the RAF lost 39 bombers. During the remainder of the war, several raids were to be made on the city, destroying more than 90% of its buildings, though the famous cathedral miraculously escaped almost intact. The 5th of June, 1942, the Battle of the Midway. The Battle of the Midway started on the 4th of June and was initially an exercise in naval hide-and-seek, as the Japanese had no inkling of the presence of the 2nd American Task Force 200 miles north of the Midway. In the beginning, things were going well for the Japanese, as their Val dive bombers attacked the Midway, guarded by Zeros, which with near contempt shot the Brewster Buffaloes out of the sky. But by the 5th of June, the tide turned when the Japanese loaded their Kate bombers with torpedoes, when in fact they needed bombs. The Battle of the Midway caused severe losses and casualties on both sides, but must be considered an American victory that was to prove one of the most decisive battles in history. The 11th of June, 1942. Rommel breaks out of the cauldron, south of Gazala. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had at the end of May 1942 been forced to take an involuntary break in his relentless advance towards the Egyptian border. Shortage of both ammunition and fuel left no options. As a result, Rommel's two panzer divisions, the 15th and the 21st, and his 90th Light were sandwiched between the British 105th Infantry Brigade, the 201st Guard Brigade, and the 32nd Army Tank Brigade. Rommel's Africa Corps had been caught in what was to become known as the Cauldron. In the end, the German panzers broke out and reached the Via Balba and could continue to push the British back beyond Tobruk. The 20th of June, 1942. Rommel attacks Tobruk. The situation in North Africa looked disappointing to General Auchinleck in the summer of 1942. Rommel had the upper hand, and there was little the British Eighth Army could do about it. The only thorn for Rommel was Tobruk. It had withstood all his assaults in 1941, but now he was determined to take the town. Rommel launched his attack in the morning of the 20th of July at the southeast of the defense perimeter. By noon, the leading panzers had established a corridor that allowed Rommel to get to the center of Tobruk by early afternoon. At this point, the German forces were exhausted, but at daybreak, the British hoisted the white flag of surrender. Rommel had finally taken Tobruk. 23rd of June, 1942. Report from Berchtesgaden. The small Bavarian town of Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps had become famous for Berghof, Hitler's retreat in the mountains nearby. It was here that Hitler came to relax and to see special friends, and it was a favorite place for his companion Eva Braun. Fräulein Braun would spend weeks there during the summer, living up to the German ideals of the young, fit Aryan, swimming, gymnastics, and sun, and most likely completely unaware of the world her lover was shaping under less pleasant circumstances. The idyllic setting here is the most glaring contradiction to the day's reality. The 25th of June, 1942. British 8th Army retreats to Mersa Matruh. Rommel's Afrika Korps had taken Tobruk on the 21st of June, 1942, and the Desert Fox had been promoted to Field Marshal. True to his habits, Rommel now wanted to push on despite the opposition from Kesselring. Rommel's argument was that the enemy was in such a disarray that they would offer token resistance to the forceful drive he had planned. Of course, Rommel was right, and on the 25th of June, General Auchinleck personally took command of the British 8th Army, trying to hold the Panzer Army along a line south of Mersa Matruh. There is no doubt that General Auchinleck was a more than competent commander, but it was too late, and there was no stopping Rommel as he pushed the British forces back. The 28th of June, 1942. Start of Operation Foul Blau. Foul Blau, Operation Blue, the code name for the German drive towards the Caucasus and Stalingrad, got underway on the 28th of June, 1942. General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army swept north of Kursk, while General von Paulus's 6th Army drove parallel south of the city, their objective Stalingrad and the lower Volga, and its oil traffic to the industrial centers. 2 days later, Army Group A crossed the Donets, heading for the southeast and the oil fields in the Caucasus. It appeared that the days of easy victories had returned, as for the first time in months the ground favored large-scale advances in open country, but Stalingrad was waiting. 2nd of July, 1942. U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff orders naval and ground forces to drive the Japanese out of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. Though the Japanese never managed to take Port Moresby, it was still paramount for the Allies to take control of the whole area to protect their southern flank in the months ahead. Australian commandos had been harassing the Japanese from the beginning, and when they were reinforced with 2 Australian battalions, they started to push up over the Stanley Range along the Kokoda Trail to try to reach Buna on the north coast, which the Japanese would strengthen before the Australians arrived. The battle for New Guinea was truly on. The 14th of July, 1942. The Battle of Tel El Isa. The famous Battle of El Alamein was in fact several battles, the first having commenced on the 1st of July, 1942. After a few days, Ruwaiset Ridge was in the hands of 21st Panzer Division, whilst the Alamein Box was in the hands of the British. The next phase opened with a number of small maneuvers, which effectively drew the Germans to the south, and climaxed with another massive bombardment by the British of the Italians in the north. Then a brigade of Australians advanced from the Alamein Box and reached Tel El Isa, bringing Rommel hurrying north. For the first time, Rommel realized that he might have been outthought by another commander. The 23rd of July, 1942. Hitler orders his forces in the east to split. The war on the Eastern Front was going well for the Germans in July 1942, and Hitler was happier than he'd been for some months. "The Russian is finished," he announced on the 20th of July, and then he went and made a big mistake. Underestimating the Soviets, he decided to split his forces in the east. 6th Army Group had to press on towards Stalingrad, while Kleist's and Hoth's panzer armies were ordered south towards the oil fields in the Caucasus. Hitler's decision might have appeared to make sense in the short term, but as the war progressed, it became evident that it had been a significant military blunder, and Germany would pay heavily within a year. The 28th of July, 1942. Stalin issues his famous order, "Not one step back." Adolf Hitler had happily announced on the 20th of July, 1942, "The Russian is finished." It was ultimately to be proved to be so much wishful thinking. On the 28th of July, Joseph Stalin issued his famous order, "Not one step back." It is, of course, possible to consider this an act of pure bravado, but it was also an important assertion that the Soviet administration believed that the Germans could be defeated. Though the Germans were still streaming forward and approaching Stalingrad, the summer of 1942 was the last time they enjoyed any superiority over the Russians. The 7th of August, 1942. U.S. forces attack Guadalcanal. On the 7th of August, 1942, 19,000 U.S. Marines were successfully landed on Guadalcanal and the neighboring small Florida island. By the evening, the Marines had chased the 2,200 Japanese construction workers off into the jungle, and 36 hours later, the 1,500 Japanese soldiers on Florida Island had been eliminated. The prize was the airfield that was under construction on Guadalcanal, which had been renamed Henderson Field. By the 20th of August, the first Wildcat fighters had landed, and the Americans had started the island hopping that slowly would turn the tide in the Pacific. 16th of August, 1942. Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill meet in Moscow. It is certainly true that war brings together the most unlikely alliances, but the communist leader Joseph Stalin did have a goal in common with the British Conservative Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the defeat of the Axis powers. At this time, von Paulus was closing on the River Don in preparation for the crossing and the assault on the important city of Stalingrad, and the Red Army had two very desperate needs: material supplies and the opening of a second front to divert some of the German forces. Despite their political differences, Stalin and Churchill agreed on a course of action, and supplies began to arrive in Murmansk, and the Allies landed in force in North Africa. 26th of August, 1942. Naval battle near Guadalcanal. By the middle of 1942, the Solomon Islands suddenly became a key strategic position, as in Japanese hands they could threaten supply routes between America and Australia. The fighting throughout the islands was fierce as the Japanese fought to land more troops in order to regain control of, amongst other key positions, the Henderson airfield on the island of Guadalcanal. As part of this campaign, a sea battle was fought off the island, known to the Japanese as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, an engagement that cost so many ships that the passage between Guadalcanal and Florida Island became known as Iron Bottom Sound. 31st of August, 1942. Rommel encounters Montgomery in the desert. The German campaign in North Africa had been directed successfully by General Erwin Rommel and the British 8th Army, the Desert Rats. It had a difficult time. A special replacement was sent out from England. He was Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, and as an opponent from the Deutsche Afrika Korps would later write, "Nothing was ever the same in North Africa after he arrived." Montgomery was a different character to previous commanders and was described by a colleague as quick as a ferret and about as likable. The confrontations between Monty and the Desert Fox became legendary. 5th September 1942. German Panzer Army at Stalingrad. The control of Stalingrad on the bend of the Volga River was strategically important. It was not only a key to the Caucasus, but also a back door to Moscow. The German 4th and 6th Panzer Armies reached the city on the 5th of September 1942, but met with a Soviet resistance that the German High Command hadn't anticipated. They were sure that the losses incurred by the Red Army would have rendered it too weak to mount a serious defense. But the Russians had anticipated the Germans and transferred south the same team which had successfully defended Moscow. Generals Voronin and Novikov and Marshal Zhukov, the man who had never lost a battle. 7th of September 1942, on the Desert Air War. Before the arrival of the Deutsche Afrika Korps in North Africa, the honors had been roughly even in the air war over the desert. The balance was changed almost single-handedly by one outstanding German fighter pilot, Oberfenrich Marseille. This young Berliner had already shot down 7 Spitfires over the English Channel by the time he arrived in North Africa in 1942, and he went on to shooting down 17 Allied fighters in a single day and reached a score of 150 when he downed 11 Allied aircraft in 11 minutes. Marseille was killed close to El Alamein when he bailed out and his parachute got tangled up in his tailplane. 21st of September 1942. Report from a KZ camp. The Wannsee Conference, held in the Berlin suburb of the same name on the 20th of January 1942, had resulted in many new camps being established and equipped with facilities for gassing people. The summer and autumn of 1942 saw the heaviest deportation of Jews to these camps. 300,000 were removed from the Warsaw Ghetto alone. Though the ultimate aim was extermination, many inmates of the camps were initially designated as workers. This was in reality just a prolonged way of killing them, as these slave laborers were worked to death. The rest were sent to camps like Auschwitz, then straight to the gas chambers and the ovens. 17th of October 1942. Bitter fighting on the Kokeda Trail at Eora Creek. The Kokeda Trail across the Owen Stanley Mountains in eastern Papua New Guinea was initially considered by the Japanese as the best route to Port Moresby. However, what the Japanese observers had thought to be a road turned out to be a 2-foot-wide jungle track, which incidentally was poorly defended, as Allied planners had thought it impossible for any substantial force to pass through the trail and attack Port Moresby from the land side. However, the Japanese proceeded against little initial resistance and had advanced a substantial distance before they met serious opposition on the 17th of October 1942 at Eora Creek. 23rd of October 1942. Start of Second Battle of El Alamein. The Battle of El Alamein was in fact 2 separate battles, though it was the second that would prove to be the most significant. This was the first confrontation between General Sir Bernard Montgomery and General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Montgomery had cautiously built up a superior force, but Rommel's Afrika Korps was well prepared and defended their positions with determination when the British attacked. However, Rommel finally had to order his overstretched forces to retreat, and they were eventually driven back 2,400 kilometers into Tunisia and lost 2,300 dead and 28,000 prisoners. The British had scored their first land victory over the German army. 26th of October 1942, Battle of Santa Cruz. The Solomons were pivotal to Japan if they wanted to attack Australia, so it was important for the Allies to retake the islands, and they landed a major force in August 1942. However, on the night of the 17th and 18th of August, the Japanese landed 1,000 troops by high-speed transport, a fast in-and-out operation that became a regular nocturnal activity and baptized the Tokyo Express. This was the start of a long and protracted battle for the islands that included the Battle of Santa Cruz, when on the 26th of October, Vice Admiral Tanaka engaged the new American commander, Vice Admiral William Halsey's forces, sinking the carrier USS Hornet. 30th of October 1942. Australians drive north at El Alamein. The Australian Imperial Force, the AIF, was the section of the Australian Armed Forces that was used for any overseas operation. By 1941, 3 divisions of the AIF had joined British Imperial forces in the Middle East, and Australian infantry was in the forefront of the early campaigns against the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, and also made up the bulk of the Tobruk garrison. During the final and decisive Battle of El Alamein, the Australian 9th Division played an important part as it drove north, helping to split the German forces, an action that eventually led to Rommel's withdrawal, which started on the 4th of November. 2nd of November 1942, Battle of El Alamein continued. On the 2nd of November 1942, the Allies under Montgomery were finally gaining the upper hand against a not fully fit Rommel, who had returned to the front from his sickbed only a few days earlier. After a fight of attrition, the Germans only had some 30 panzers left, and the Afrika Korps was literally on the brink of extinction and began to withdraw, though ordered back on the offensive by Hitler. The Eighth Army, with a 20-to-1 superiority in tanks, now split the German forces, and Rommel had no alternative but to go against the Führer and retreat in order to save the remains of his army. 4th of November 1942. Rommel retreat. The remains of Rommel's 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions had hurled themselves at the British Eighth Army at Durham Corner on the 2nd of November 1942, and both sides had suffered considerable casualties, though the British had greater reserves to draw on. The Germans were forced off the field of battle, leaving behind their wrecks, dead and even wounded. This was the action that finally broke the strength of the Deutsche Afrika Korps and ended the Battle of El Alamein. So, finally, on the 4th of November, and ignoring Hitler's demand not to retreat, Rommel orders the withdrawal of his forces, leaving behind only a few stragglers, some wrecked artillery, areas of uncleared mines, and some ingenious booby traps. 5th of November 1942, Montgomery importance in the desert. There is little doubt that one of the reasons for the Germans' change of fortune in the desert was the arrival of Lieutenant General Sir Bernard Law Montgomery as commander of the British Eighth Army. This energetic general might not have had the tactical talent of his opponent Rommel, but he did make his mark. Montgomery was not instantly popular with his men and officers. He was extremely demanding, as an incident shortly after he arrived indicates. A great believer in physical fitness, he ordered a rather pear-shaped officer to run 7 miles. The officer stated that this would surely kill him, to which Montgomery replied, "Good, die now and we can get a fit replacement before the battle starts." 8th of November 1942, Operation Torch gets underway. Operation Torch was the code name for the Anglo-American invasion of French Northwest Africa that started on the 8th of November 1942. It had always been a priority to create a second front, and North Africa was the obvious choice, as success here would lead to control over the Mediterranean. The giant convoys started their synchronized landing at 1 a.m. There was little resistance from the French forces stationed in the area, despite the fact that Pétain tried to avoid the German occupation of Vichy France, and by the 9th of November, General Mark Clark started to negotiate for a ceasefire with the French Admiral Darlan. 10th of November 1942, Mosquito bombers raid Bremerhaven. The twin-engine de Havilland Mosquito was not only an extremely versatile aircraft, but also the fastest in the RAF. The performance of the first prototype was so impressive that it was promptly ordered as both a fighter and a bomber and became the aircraft with the lowest loss rate within RAF Bomber Command. Though unarmed, it was too fast to be intercepted. The Mosquito was instrumental in numerous bombing raids over Germany itself, not least the mission against the German port of Bremerhaven on the 10th of November 1942. A strategically important target with U-boat pens and other valuable military installations. The 11th of November 1942, Germans complete total occupation of France. The Allied landings in French-occupied North Africa changed dramatically the Vichy government's position at home. Prior to the invasion, Major General Mark Clark had been smuggled ashore by British commandos and talked to the French commander, General Mast, and after the landing negotiations continued with Admiral Darlan. Though the authority was vested in Marshal Pétain, Darlan went ahead with the talks, and on the 10th of November he ordered an end to all French resistance in North Africa. The Germans naturally realized that any further cooperation with the French would be futile and consequently occupied the rest of France the following day. 13th of November 1942. 8th Army reaches Tobruk. The Libyan port and fortress of Tobruk had changed hands several times during the Desert War. It had been under siege, defeated, retaken, isolated, and virtually destroyed in the process. Tobruk had significantly been taken by Rommel in a single day, after his victory at Gazala on the 25th of June 1942, when no less than 35,000 British troops surrendered. When the Deutsche Afrika Korps had to retreat after the last Battle of El Alamein, it was no longer possible for Rommel to maintain a reasonable defense of the port, and finally, on the 13th of November, it changed hands for the last time when it was abandoned by the Germans. 16th of November 1942. Australian and U.S. forces meet on Bunagona beachhead. The 7th Australian Division had reached the ridge of the Owen Stanley Mountains on the Kokoda Trail and retaken the town of Kokoda on 2nd of November 1942 against fierce Japanese opposition in difficult terrain. It was now possible to reopen the local airfield, which could give supporting cover all the way to the small port Buna on the north coast, the main objective for this campaign. The Australian forces suffered horrendous casualties, but finally reached the coast and could join the Americans on the Bunagona beachhead on the 16th of November. 19th of November 1942. Marshal Zhukov launches counteroffensive at Stalingrad. The 6th German Panzer Army, commanded by General von Paulus, had reached the important city of Stalingrad in early September 1942 against fierce Soviet opposition. On the 19th of November, Marshal Zhukov launches his long-awaited counteroffensive, now against a weakened German force. Contrary to claims from Berlin, German casualties had so far exceeded Red Army losses. Zhukov had carefully kept his casualties to a minimum and could count on up to 11 armies that had kept virtually all their equipment intact. This was undoubtedly one of the deciding factors on the Eastern Front. 20th of November 1942. Soviet offensive at Stalingrad. Marshal Zhukov had launched the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad on the morning of 19th of November 1942 in snow and fog. Red Army armored spearheads hit the Romanian forces south and west of the city, and after 3 days of hard fighting, the Soviet armies met on the Don River, encircling the German 6th Army, half of the 4th Panzer Army, and several Romanian units. Hitler ordered the German commander, von Paulus, not to withdraw, and promised him air supplies and relief by Field Marshal Manstein. Neither materialized, and as Hitler still would not permit an attempt to break out, the 6th Army was doomed. 2nd of December 1942. Australians consolidate at Gona, Papua New Guinea. Australian forces had successfully crossed Papua New Guinea using the Kokoda Trail across the Owen Stanley Mountains and had met up with U.S. forces on the Bunagona beachhead on the 16th of November 1942. On the 1st of December, Gona, south of the town of Buna, was taken and the Australians could consolidate their precarious position the following day. However, the Japanese were not dislodged from their stand on the Kamusi River north of Buna and would fight on bitterly through 1942 before they were finally defeated on the 21st of January 1943. And now only because the Allies managed to bring fresh American and Australian troops up along the trail. 4th of December 1942. British driven out of Tabourba, Tunisia. After Rommel's withdrawal during the Second Battle of El Alamein, it was the British 8th Army, the Desert Rats, that decidedly had the upper hand in the desert. Allied troops had landed in the opposite end of North Africa, in Morocco and Algiers, on the 8th of November 1942, and the important battle for Tunisia was to follow. The Germans were aware that the Desert War had reached a pivotal point, and were determined in their defense and could still mount a serious challenge, as they did on the 4th of December, when von Armand's 5th Army managed to drive the British out of Tabourba. 20th of December 1942, U.S. and Australian troops confront Japanese forces in Papua New Guinea. Australian forces had crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains in Papua New Guinea using the Kokoda Trail in mid-October 1942 and met up with the Americans on the Bunagona beachhead on the 16th of November. Though Gona had been secured by the 2nd of December, it still had not been possible to dislodge the Imperial forces from the area. They made a particularly determined stand at the Kamusi River, and the fighting was to go on for some weeks yet, and with mounting casualties on both sides. The New Guinea campaign cost the Japanese over 12,000 men, and Allied casualties exceeded 8,500. 24th of December 1942. Christmas with troops in North Africa. Allied forces had landed at Algiers, Oran, and Casablanca at the beginning of Operation Torch on the 8th of November 1942, and 6 hard weeks of continuous fighting in the desert had followed, the aim to take Tunisia and drive all Axis troops out of North Africa. But even in the midst of war, Christmas offers some respite, and the holy day was celebrated throughout the front. Of course, there were letters and cards from home and presents for the lucky ones. And there were religious services, not forgetting a rare feast, even though the desert makes a strange setting for roast turkey and Christmas pudding. "25th of December 1942. Germans resist attack on Long Stop Hill in Tunisia. The Christmas turkey had hardly been digested before the Allied drive towards Tunisia continued. Long Stop Hill in the mountains in the west of the country was attacked by U.S. forces, but the German defenders put up a determined resistance. This is largely a fight between green American GIs and battle-hardened German veterans, with experience gained in numerous desert campaigns. The American casualties are frighteningly high, and for no initial territorial gain, but a lesson had been learned. The 28th of December 1942. Japanese withdraw from Buna. Allied forces, predominantly Australians, had been engaged in fierce fighting with the Japanese near Buna on the north coast of New Guinea ever since they crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains from Port Moresby in mid-November 1942. The fighting had been particularly hard close to the Kamusi River, where the Japanese held out against superior forces for several weeks. However, in the end, the constant pressure and the arrival of fresh Allied troops finally took its toll, and on the 28th of December, the Imperial forces were forced to withdraw from Buna.